we have now come to this section on quadratic inequalities. Now, I'm sure you can solve basic inequality question like this. Okay, simply bring this negative x over to the left hand side, becomes a plus, so you have 2x greater than 4, right? And therefore x will be greater than 2. So this kind of linear inequality shouldn't be too much of a headache for you. So how about an inequality involving quadratic expression like this one? Now, of course you must know that you can't solve this quadratic inequality the way you solve your linear inequality, right? You cannot just make x subject easily in a quadratic expression like this. So how do we do it then? Well, simple. All we have to do is to factorize. Okay, every time you see a quadratic inequality like this, you factorize. Alright, and in this factorization, you will get x plus 1, x minus 3. After you factorize, this is where many people tend to make careless mistake. Okay, so you have to be very careful. And as well, there are many methods, in fact a total of 3 different methods to do from this step on. Okay, so I'll teach you the curve sketching method, right, which I find is the most useful method because it can be useful all the way until your A levels. Okay, so how do we continue from here after you factorize? Very simple. After you factorize, now what are these? You should know that these are called the roots. Okay, these are also the factors, right? So you know that there is a root at x equals to -1 and there is a root at x equals to +3. The next thing that you must look out for will be what kind of curve is this? Is this a minimum curve or is this a maximum curve? So by looking at the coefficient of the x square, which is a +1, you should know that this is a happy face curve, right? Which is a minimum curve this way. So all you have to do now is to sketch out the shape of the curve. Now it doesn't have to be accurate. Okay, in fact it doesn't even have to have the xy axis. Alright, the x-axis is there because you need to know where it will intersect the x-axis. Okay, notice that I didn't even put in the y-axis. Okay, so this is enough, alright, to help us solve this quadratic inequality. How do we solve the quadratic inequality next? Well, next thing we must figure out is this. Okay, the sign here. Now this is a greater than sign. So what this tells us is that this quadratic expression has to be greater than 0. So this quadratic expression is plotted into this curve. Alright, now this curve represents this quadratic expression here. So when will this curve be greater than 0? Well, the curve will be greater than 0 only for this part and this part, isn't it? Okay, for between -1 to 3, alright, the curve will be underneath. It will be negative. So you don't want the part of the curve to be negative, you want the positive part of the curve. Right? So the x value, okay, will of course be x less than -1 or x more than 3. Okay, so this will be your final answer. This will be the answer to this quadratic inequality. Simple? Well, I hope so. Let's take a look at one more. Alright, now this quadratic inequality here, alright, as you may notice, the first thing that catches your eye must be, this -2. This is a maximum quadratic expression. So the first thing that I would do is I'll multiply throughout by -1. So that I'll end up with a +2x plus x minus 3 less than or equal to 0. Okay, because every time you multiply throughout by a negative number, you have to change the sign of the inequality. And why would I want to multiply throughout by a -1? Well, it's a personal preference actually, because I find a lot easier to factorize with a +2 2x squared. Okay, but again, if you think that you can handle negative 2x squared to factorize it, by all means go ahead. Okay, as well, I want to highlight to you or to remind you that whenever you multiply throughout by negative number, you will have to change the inequality sign. So when do we change inequality sign? Well, like I mentioned earlier, we will change the inequality sign when we multiply or divide throughout by a negative number. Now this is a very simple concept to understand. For example, now all of us know that 3 will be greater than 1, isn't it? Now let's say I were to multiply throughout by negative 1 throughout, so my positive 3 will become negative 3 and my negative 1, okay, 1 will become negative 1. So is it still correct to say that, well, negative 3 is greater than negative 1? Well, obviously this is wrong, right? So therefore that is the reason why we have to change the sign whenever we multiply or divide throughout by a negative number. Case number 2, when we change the inequality sign, will be when we reciprocate both sides. Alright, again, as an example, for example, I have 3 greater than 1, isn't it? Okay, now let's say I were to reciprocate both sides. So my 3 will become 1 over 3 and my 1 will still become 1 over 1, which is 1. So I reciprocated both sides. Can I still say that, you know, 1/3 is greater than 1? So obviously again this is wrong, isn't it? So there are only 2 ways or 2 scenarios whereby you have to change your inequality sign. Alright, and these 2 are listed out here. Alright, so you may want to make a note somewhere to remind yourself of the situation whereby you have to change your inequality sign. So let's get back to our question. Here we go. So we are now faced with this quadratic inequality. So what's the first step we do? Well, we factorize, isn't it? So we factorize, we will get 2x plus 3 and of course x minus 1, alright, being less than or equal to 0. So the next step after we factorize will be to draw, okay, to sketch. So this will be still a positive minimum curve. Okay, so we draw, we know that it will cut at negative 3 over 2 and it will cut the x-axis at positive 1. Now we are interested in the parts of the curve that is less than or equal to 0. Okay, so simply look for the part that is underneath the x-axis. So underneath the x-axis will be here, isn't it? Okay, so it's not that difficult to identify, I think. So therefore the range of our values of x will be between minus 3 over 2 to positive 1. So our x value will be between minus 3 over 2 to positive 1. So this will be our answer. Now, I mentioned earlier on that after factorizing is where many people will start to make careless mistakes. So let's take a look at one of the most common mistakes that people always make. Okay, so hopefully after I tell you about this careless mistake that people make, you won't be facing the same situation with the same kind of mistake. So let us just take this question here as an example. Now, x plus 1, x minus 3 greater than 0. Okay, now that you have learned it well, okay, you should know that after this factorization step you should be drawing the curve, okay, and then identify whether you're looking for the positive part or the negative part of the curve. But what many people tend to forget, okay, or tend to do is this. Okay, they would think that, well, okay, so I have factorized it and this is x plus 1, x minus 3 is like greater than 0. This is simple, I've seen this somewhere before. So, well, x plus 1 greater than 0 or x minus 3 greater than 0. So therefore it will be greater than negative 1 or x has to be greater than, well, positive 3. So, of course, the person who come up with this solution, okay, is not going to get a full marks. Alright, now why is this wrong? Why is this wrong? Very simple. Now this is wrong because this is an inequality, it is not an equal sign. Now if this were to be an equal sign, then his working will be totally correct. Okay, because all of us know that, okay, let me find some space here. Okay, great. Right, now all of us know that when we have x plus 1 multiplied by x minus 3 equals to 0, yes, indeed, our x will be equal to -1 or +3. This is absolutely correct. But this is only correct because this is 0. I mean, this is equal to 0. Right? But it doesn't work for inequalities like this. Okay? Now, anyway, the answers that you have here is not going to make any sense. I mean, think about it. You're talking about an x value that's greater than -1 or an x value that's greater than +3. So if you are greater than +3, you are obviously greater than -1, right? So this solution here is not making any sense, and therefore this is another reason why it is wrong. Okay, so do not learn whatever that's in the red. Okay, it is here because I want you to realize what many people tend to do. Right, so now you learn it well and you remember it. Every time you face with a quadratic inequality, the first thing you do, you factorize, okay, and then you sketch the curve. After you sketch the curve, you identify the parts whereby you need for the solution, whether you need the positive part, which will be the part above the x-axis, or when you need the negative part, which is the part that's less than 0 and the part that's underneath the x-axis.